So for this lecture, we're going to start by talking about the notions of race and biological diversity in humans. And this is kind of, I throw this graph on here because, there's a lot of argument currently as to whether or not what portions of climate change and things like that are human driven. Amongst the scientific community, there's much consensus that climate change is human driven. We don't know exactly what portions other than our greenhouse gases is really driving some of the climate change. But really is kind of a very basic, if we kind of take a step back and stop looking at it so specifically and just look at a basic correlation or effect that humans have had on the globe throughout our history, we look at extinction rates, right? And as we move, you can see that as humans' populations rise, extinctions rise exponentially, right? So it's a little bit too much of a close association to really be just coincidence, right? So there really is a human component that is driving the extinction of many species across the planet. So looking at what's considered, quote, the 5 criteria of race that's outlined in your textbook, it says that 1, races reflect some type of biological foundation, be it Aristotelian essentialism or modern genes, right? This biological foundation generates discrete racial groupings such that all and only all members of one race share a set of biological characteristics that are not shared by members of other races, right? And as we kind of move through this list, I want you to really critically think about what these criteria are really saying, right? Can we really say that there is any set of biological characteristics in one given human that's only for that specific set, right? So the third kind of point is that the biological foundation, of course, is inherited from generation to generation, allowing observers to identify an individual's race through his or her ancestry or genealogy. Wrapping up with the last 2 kind of absurdity criteria on race here is the genealogical investigation should identify each race's geographic origin, typically in Africa, Europe, Asia, or North or South America. This inherited racial biological foundation manifests itself primarily in physical phenotypes such as skin color, eye shape, hair texture, bone structure, and also behavioral phenotypes such as intelligence or delinquency. Right, so now this is what I want you to say, or kind of what we are going to outlining is kind of some of the first modern classic criteria for determining what scientifically, with big quotation marks, what is considered race, right? And throughout the semester, we're going to kind of address each of these criteria and kind of break them down into really revealing how false they actually are. So really kind of our earliest notions on race were based off of philosophical notions on what it means to be considered a human, right? We had the philosophers that believed that all humans had a, quote, basic nature, right? If we're looking at Plato, it was the notion of genos, right, or self. If we're looking at Aristotle, we have essentialism, right, or that everything has some sort of essential nature. And it's really this notion of essentialism that really kind of a lot of the early scientists latched onto in their kind of descriptions of race, right? It was this notion of this, well, all of these people of a particular race have an essential nature. We're going to use scientific measurement to prove that essential nature. But once we actually start to look at, the human species, more importantly, our DNA, we start to realize that there's a lot of commonality that we share with other life forms on this planet, right? For example, humans share 99.8% of their DNA with chimpanzees, right? And we actually diverged from their lineage at about 7 to 9 million years ago. And that's what really started the kickoff to our ancient ancestors. We share roughly 70% of our DNA with slugs, right? So we are separated from kind of the other great apes based on our ability to learn and use symbolic language, right? So it's really that whole notion that we can tell someone all about our day and ask them questions about their day and interact with a conversation using the symbolic system called language. That's what really separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. So to kind of act as an introduction to what we'll be talking about for the rest of this lecture and into the coming weeks, how do we define race, right? Is there a biological foundation for race? How is race constructed in various cultures, right? What is the social construct and how does it relate to race? And how old exactly is racism? So if we look at one of those points, what is a social construct, right? A social construct is ontologically subjective, but epistemologically objective, right? It is ontologically subjective in that the construction and continued existence of social constructs are contingent on social groups and their collective agreement and acceptive of such constructions, right? So in essence, right, epistemologically it's objective because we can measure it. We can measure its effects, right? We can measure the effect that race has on society and on certain groups within our society. But it's ontologically subjective because race only exists because we all believe that it exists, right? It's one of those notions that it exists because, well, we created it in the past, created cultural institutions around it, perpetuated inequality using race, and now race exists because of those early cultural institutions, right? And there's actually no real or scientific or biologic foundation to support the notion of race. So in essence, race has no biological basis, right? If we were to define it, it's a cultural classification system by which physical characteristics are used to divide human populations into quote unquote supposedly discrete groups, right? There are no real single true genetic marker that indicates someone's skin color. Skin color is what we call polygenic, right? It's controlled by a set of genes, right? And skin color, as we'll learn in the coming semesters, really has nothing to do with your current your current situation, but it was really where your ancestors were born and where they originally developed, right? Whether they developed in a very sunny region versus a non-sunny region, but we'll go into more detail about that later. So as we move through and begin to talk about human biological diversity, we're going to talk about genotypes versus phenotypes, right? And the genotype are the genes which comprise an organism's genetic code, whereas the phenotype is how that genetic code is expressed physically, right? So in essence, your genes are what is on the inside, your DNA, all of your genes, and your phenotype, right? That's all what's on the outside, right? Your skin tone, your eye color, your hair texture, things like that, that would all be considered part of your phenotypic expression. So why did the concept of race arise originally? Well, the concept of race or racial categories were created to justify this notion of classism, right? It's easier to attach stereotypes to those people or to deny them access to equal wealth systems, healthcare, or education, right? An example of a classist system would be colonialism, right? It was that whole notion of going in and kind of subjugating another group of people for your own economic gain, right? So race, or this concept of race, really arose because people saw inequality within their societies, right, and began to have to justify the existence of that inequality. In order to justify that inequality or justify its existence, you have to create some sort of valid explanation for why it exists, right? Well, it makes it a lot easier to treat someone poorly if you can view them as maybe a little bit less like yourself and more different, right? Or essentially in some cases, some extreme cases, a different species than yourself, right? It kind of makes those interactions or those kind of cruelties or those social inequalities easier to bear. So, did racism exist before the kind of scientific notion of race, right? So, does racism necessarily have to relate to skin tone? Well, before skin tone, people were discriminated based on language or dress, right? So, in essence, when we look at racism, or kind of how I define or how I look at racism from a education or an objective standpoint, is it's really any group of people that feels or believes that another group of people somehow fundamentally different biologically than themselves, right? So in the early days in ancient Greece and otherwhere, it was really kind of, they were seen as biologically different fundamentally, not based on skin tone, but based on differences in language or cultural dress. So if we look at the kind of classical period between 300 to 600 AD, this is where we kind of see that notion of cultural racism. It's racism not due to anatomical features, but rather cultural affiliation, right? This is kind of where we get the word barbarian, which originated from Greece as a word for meaning non-Greek, right? So in essence, for the Greek, anyone who was not Greek was not quite human, right? Not human on the same level as the Greek were, right? So they'd pretty much classified anyone who was non-Greek as a separate race, right, than themselves. So it wasn't really based on skin color specifically, it was based on culture, language, and a whole host of other factors. If we look at the Middle Ages from 1800 to 1500 AD in both the Middle East and Europe, this is where we see kind of a shift. We're no longer looking at kind of this kind of geographic heritage like the Greek, right? You know, simply anyone who is not Greek is a different race. This is where kind of the popularity of organized and modern religions start to really take foothold, right? So religious affiliation was essentially used to discriminate and segregate people in multicultural societies, right? So people of the Jewish religion were often discriminated against in a variety of ways, right? And this is where the first determinist biological theories begin to emerge, right? This is where, oh, these people act this way because that's how they are. That's how their entire race is, right? So when you start getting this kind of cementation of the notion of race, you start to see this kind of, afterwards, you start to see this notion of biological justification for it. So in essence, non-Christians across Europe were viewed as barbaric, unclean, and savage. Many Christians sincerely believed that Jewish people ate children and worshiped Satan, and Jewish people were then viewed as being a biologically inferior subspecies to the normal kind of quote-unquote Christian humans, right? And you can actually see in one of the images here kind of a fantastical depiction of Jewish people. So kind of after the Enlightenment period or the kind of development of the modern scientific method and things like that, we started to see race being defined on anatomical traits rather than simple cultural affiliation. So things like skin color, skull size, long bone length, or blood group began to be ever more important in terms of determining racial categories. So if we look at some of the earlier scientists who started to look at this notion of race and racism, we have Francois Berthier from 1684. He's one of the earliest naturalists, and he was interested in recording differences in people through the kind of the travels he was doing throughout Africa, Asia, and Europe. He did not assign behavioral traits to races, as would later scientists, but he did propose that there could be up to 5 separate races, right? It insisted that races could be used to divide the world into 5 separate societies. So as we move into kind of the 18th and 19th centuries here, we start to see folk and scientific notions on race beginning to diverge in the kind of early 1900s. Anthropologists and other scientists observed there was a clinal variation in measurable traits, and really this just means that traits don't change immediately. If we look at skin tone, for example, it's not like as you're walking north in Africa, all of a sudden you hit the land of white people. It doesn't really work that way. What you're going to see is that as you start moving away from the equator, you're going to start seeing lighter shades, lighter shades, lighter shades, lighter shades, right, until you get to kind of the edges of the northern periphery there. We also see a non-concordant variation of traits, right, meaning that essentially traits are not the same within each, quote, racial subgrouping. And we all know that there's a single African origin, right? We all trace our mitochondrial DNA. It all goes back to Ethiopia at or around 280,000 years ago. So essentially, the more traits you looked at, the more races you could see. In essence, if we just use physical characteristics, right? So physical measurements do not identify distinct categories of humans to correspond with these folk notions of race. But we are going to talk about kind of how this whole science of race has developed over the years. So if we look at another early proponent, we have Georges S Cuvier from 1817. Some of you may have seen him in a paleontology class or a evolution class, as he is the father of modern paleontology. But he also dabbled a lot with human dissection, right? And he dissected Sarah Bartman upon her death in 1817. Sarah was a native woman from Cape Town, South Africa, right? And Cuvier said, based on her anatomy, that she was more similar to that of an orangutan than that of a human, right? And Sarah spent her life on display in a traveling zoo in Europe. And actually, I'm going to post a link for a documentary, or at least I can hope I can find it, called Inhuman Zoos, right? Humans were actually kept in zoos for well over 100 years, right? And you would be surprised that the last human zoo closed down in the 1950s, right? So, in essence, why did we have scientists trying to prove this kind of notion that there are races, right? Well, what they wanted to find was a different way in which Africans evolved into human, right? So, essentially, a different evolutionary path would justify the existing social order, right? White people being on top because, of course, they are further evolved or further along down the path than Africans are, right? So this was during a time when most Africans refuted a common ape human ancestor. So in essence, what they wanted to say is that humans, or basically essentially European white people, evolved down a different path than African people. Of course, African people being closer to apes and the European white people being further removed, right? So if they could prove that there were two separate evolutionary paths, then there would be no need to give African people equal consideration in government, equal consideration in society, or equal consideration in international trade. If we look at another individual from kind of our side of the pond here in America, we have Samuel Morton from 1840. He was an American geologist and physician from Pennsylvania. He supported the notion of polygenism, or that there were multiple creation events in evolutionary history, right? Or essentially in what he's saying is that there are multiple events in which God created multiple rounds of creatures, right? So this kind of refuted the biblical notion of Noah's Ark based on his examinations of Egyptian mummies, right? And in your Gould book, he goes into much more detail about this. And he claimed that people of African descent were inferior based on measurements of their brain size. So in essence, for much of the kind of 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, we've been kind of dabbling with this notion of biological determinism, right? Or that people's behavioral tendencies or cultural practices are all determined by biology, right? So for much of the 19th century, European as well as American scientists were trying to enforce a dogma which asserted you can rank humans based on race, and that intelligence corresponds directly to race, right? Going back to Samuel Morton as an example, he collected skulls from various cultures around the world, filled the skulls with chickpeas and other materials, and asserted that Africans and African Americans were less intelligent based on skull size. Well, long story short, Morton spent a lifetime trying to justify the status quo by asserting a biological foundation for the social inequality of the day using fraudulent data and unscrupulous statistical testing. And if you read the Gould book, he'll actually outline exactly where Morton was fudging his numbers. If we look at another prominent figure, we have Josiah Nott from 1854 from the United States. He published the book Types of Mankind, in which he used cranial characteristics in the skull, i.e. cranial capacity, to attempt to prove that those of African descent had smaller brains, thus were less intelligent. And he initially actually started his career as a good scientist, debunking kind of the miasma hypothesis for how yellow fever spread, but he later kind of gave in and devolved into this kind of fraudulent scientific testing to try and prove why Africans were inferior, right? And this was all essentially being done against a backdrop of African people being freed in the United States and kind of upcoming to the Civil War here, and kind of being more rumblings of more equality, right? And kind of this whole notion that maybe we shouldn't be keeping African people in bondage, that we shouldn't be participating in the slave trade, and that perhaps, African people should be, or, have much more to contribute to society than what we've kind of set them for in terms of during that kind of slavery period in the United States, right? So really scientists began to really combat, or some scientists, I don't want to say all, there were a few exceptions, but scientists began to combat against this kind of whole abolitionist movement using science to prove, well, we don't need to give them freedom because, well, they're less intelligent and wouldn't be able to manage themselves on their own. I know that I kind of make it sound very brutish, but this really was the kind of prevailing dogma of the day. It sounds very ridiculous today, but this is what people thought back then. Going along with one of our dissenters of the prominent dogma of the time, we do have a anthropologist, actually considered the father of American anthropology. His name is Franz Bos, and he founded the first American School of Anthropology at the University of Chicago in 1896. He championed the ethnographic method during his work amongst the Kwakiutl people of the northwestern of the United States. And he contributed two major things to modern anthropological theory. He developed the notion of biological relativism, and more importantly, he debunked biological determinism. So what Boas was essentially fighting against was this notion of scientific racism. And later on in the semester, we'll actually look at a couple of Boas's, maybe there might be one in this presentation. We'll look at a couple of Boas's studies that he did that really debunk this notion that that things like intelligence and morality and all of these kind of behavioral tendencies are not biologically determined, right? That they are actually determined by a complex mixture of environment, biology, and social rearing, as well as what the predominant popularity and what pop culture is in the culture you're living in at the time in which you were being raised, right? So Franz Boas really was very vocal on the notion that, we can't really attribute any cultural traits strictly to biology. So kind of the culmination of scientific racism didn't really occur till the end of the kind of 19th century into the early 20th century with this kind of eugenics movement, right? And eugenics is defined as the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics. And the father of eugenics was actually Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, right? And really this is based off of a really terrible oversimplification of Darwinian evolutionary theory, right? That we can select the best amongst us and only those people would be allowed to reproduce, and that would slowly improve the human species over time. In reality, what that would actually do is it would slowly decrease the variation in human species and make us more susceptible to genetic diseases, as well as making us more susceptible to environmental selective pressures, right? We won't be as adaptable or genetically responsive to environmental forces if we don't have as large of a gene pool to work with, right? So this is more based, or this notion of eugenics is more based on explaining and justifying social inequality and barbarism than it really is trying to get at some sort of fundamental scientific truth. So if we look at another prominent figure in the kind of supporting the notion of race, we have Clayton Coon in the 1930s. He created over 30 racial categories. They were based on cranial and postcranial measurements, so measurements of the skull as well as the rest of the skeleton. And he defined a race as any somatically unique population or collection of populations, right? So what Coon was looking for was anatomical similarities, and this was based off of a pitifully small sample size, about 200 skeletons. And I will tell you this, if you are trying to make a scientific assertion about a species as large and complex as the human species, you really are going to need a lot more than a sample of 200 to have any statistical validity in any of your assertions. We also have a gentleman named from the 1950s named William C. Boyd, who looked at defining race based on shared genes like those that produce your specific blood group, right? So he would say the African race is defined by its high frequency of the Rh plus allele and the B blood type, right? And he admitted that racial categories were arbitrary and that the lines dividing races will always be blurred. So essentially, even towards the end of his life, he really kind of admitted that there really was no actual realistic biological foundation to race, just this kind of patterns that he saw that really if you're looking at just one specific trait, sure, you'll see some patterns, but those patterns will not be consistent when we start adding more traits to the mix. So he did his field work in Africa, Polynesia, and Eastern Europe, collecting blood samples from various indigenous populations. Another one of our dissenters, along with Franz Bos, is W.E.D. Dubois, who is the first black PhD at Harvard, and he lived from 1868 to 1963. He was a Pan-Africanist, and he believed in the radical notion at the time of equality. He was the publisher of the NAACP's the Crisis, and he was a devout communist. And it's kind of interesting to see that today that part of his history is kind of really kind of muddied and not really talked about a whole lot. But if we take a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., he said it's kind of time to cease muting the fact that Dr. Du Bois was a genius and chose to be a communist, right? And really what MLK was saying is that, you know, we really shouldn't be demonizing communism to the degree that we are. There are plenty of brilliant people who have looked at the political structure and have chosen to become communist, right? But in any sense, W.E.D. Du Bois was a very outspoken figure at the time, kind of combating against this biological notion that there is such a thing as race, and that more importantly, that intelligence can be directly corresponded to race. We also have Ashley Montague from 1950. So whereas we have, William Boyd saying that there is such a thing as race, at the very same time we have Ashley Montague, a very prominent biologist who refuted the notion of race and racial categories and actually published the UNESCO Statement on race. He argued for the biological superiority of women from an evolutionary perspective, saying that women, in terms of evolution, are more valuable because they are capable of rearing children and providing a vessel for birth, right? So we'll actually take a look at the UNESCO study or UNESCO Statement on Race here in a second. So this is the UNESCO Statement on Race, which was published in the 1950s. It says that in the matters of race, the only characteristics that anthropologists can effectively use as a basis for classification are physical and physiological. According to present knowledge, there is no proof that the groups of mankind differ in their innate mental characteristics in respects of intelligence or temperament. Historical and sociological studies support the view that genetic differences are not of importance in determining the social and cultural differences between different groups of Homo sapiens. There is no evidence that race mixture as such produces bad results from the biological point of view, right? The social results of race mixture, for good or ill, are to be traced to social factors. So the next couple slides are going to show you human zoos, right, or different groups of native people that were living in human zoos from the mid-1800s all the way up until the 1950s, right? These include indigenous people from Southeast Asia. They include indigenous people from North America, as well as indigenous people from Africa. So in essence, with these human zoos, people were displayed as curiosities for over 100 years. People were generally kidnapped or coerced into participating, and these zoos were used to justify social inequality, right? And kind of a fun fact for you, the first actual government to ban human zoos was the government run by Hitler. But what I want you, I'm going to try and post maybe next week or perhaps the week after, a video called Inhuman Zoos. I want you to watch that video. It's about the case of Odo Benga and the New York Zoological Park, or is now today called the Bronx Zoo, right? And how they housed an African man on display for years. And today actually refuse to admit the kind of racist history of Odo Benga and their kind of early days there. So I urge you to kind of check out that documentary. It's really interesting in terms of tracing kind of these early justifications for social inequality and race. So the question you might be asking at this point, since we've already made it up to the 1950s, is when did really scientific racism end? Well, long story short, it actually hasn't, right? It still rears its ugly head every couple of years, right? In the 1990s, we had the bell curve, which sought to prove that you can rank human intelligence based on race. This was later debunked by Stephen Jay Gould, the author of one of your books, and the Shaker City school system in Shaker Heights, Ohio. And we also have Nicholas Wade in 2014, who published A Troublesome Inheritance, which echoed earlier notions of intelligence and biological difference based on race. So if you come across these two books, The Bell Curve or the book entitled A Troublesome Inheritance, you can toss it right in the trash can. It is broad-stroked, just really terrible science. And really, when we start to actually look at things in more detail and start to do subsequent studies and try to test the assumptions that they make in these books, they don't hold up, right? So if we look at a more recent debate that's kind of occurred over the past few years, we have the kind of debate of the Cheddar Man, which occurred in 2018. And the Cheddar Man was Britain's first human, essentially. And he's an anatomically modern human dating to around 9,100 BC. And there was a huge debate over his skin tone, right? He had common genetic markers seen in modern populations, right? He had blue eyes, dark hair, and a dark skin tone, right? So the controversy was really over when they first published the findings from Cheddar Man. The kind of scientists succumbed to the social pressure and made him appear to be a lot lighter skinned than he actually should have been, right? And we know what his skin should have been because he was not that far removed from when humans first left Africa. So there simply was not enough time for his adaptive response to the sun and to vitamin D to really lighten his skin tone enough. And we'll talk about vitamin D and skin tone later on in the semester, but for our intensive purposes here, essentially the controversy was over. Everyone thought he should have been white when in reality he was not. So he was also lactose intolerant. We know that based off of his DNA. If we look at Cheddarman's cave here, it's called Gough Cave, and it had a long occupation period from around 11,000 BC all the way up to 3,000 BC. There are multiple occupations and even evidence of some cannibalism occurring there, right? So this is a place where humans have been living for quite some time. So here we can actually see, the first original photo that I showed you a couple slides ago was how Cheddar Man actually looked, right, based on the real science. But the photo that you see here is the first rendition that they released of the Cheddar Man, right? So the kind of debate is that most racists really assume that the first British person would be bright, right? Its argument is based off of the polygenic nature of skin tone, and it defies actual first-hand accounts by Roman soldiers, right? So in essence, these racists were saying that this is how Cheddar Man should have looked, dark hair, blue eyes, white skin. But when we actually look at the polygenic nature of skin, and when we actually look at the first accounts by the first Roman soldiers that came to the area, they outlined and described that the individuals living there were individuals of dark skin tone, more tan to black skin tone. So after they kind of parsed out the polygenic nature of Cheddar Man's skin tone, this is what Cheddar Man should have actually, or this is the most accurate representation of what England's first human would have looked like. So in essence, I hope by this point you have gotten the notion that there is no requirement that we divide the human species, Homo sapiens, into different subspecies or races, right? There are no pure races anywhere, and there are very few genetic markers that are common to every one of a quote-unquote particular race. So today, in terms of anthropology, we really try to focus more on the notion of ethnicity, right? This is the kind of the term we use today, the term ethnic groups, right? And ethnic groups are defined by shared cultural characteristics like language, geography, and cultural practices, right? So we're not, scientists or social scientists are no longer focusing on, we can prove that, these behavioral tendencies are related directly to skin tone. No, we are now more focusing on, what is the culture of a specific group of people, and how do we define groups of people based on shared culture rather than on skin tone? So if we look at just within group anatomical variation, right, there is vast morphological differences within any given population of a single species, right? Most of the variation is due to historical trends in marriage practices and diet as well. This type of variation is known as polymorphic variation. If we're looking at variation or anatomical variation between groups, right? So we're looking at between, let's say, a group of Siberian hunters in Europe or in Asia, excuse me, and we're looking at a group of Native American hunters, right? Those are two distinct human populations that live in different geographic regions. If we're looking at the anatomical variation between those two groups, we're looking at it slightly different. So this is essentially observed gene patterns between geographically separated human populations, right? It can be some phenotypic traits, but this type of variation is generally known as polytypic variation within a species, right? So within a given species, you have different types of variation. There's polymorphic versus polytypic variation. In terms of genes, genetically, humans are not a very diverse species. We do not have a whole lot of variation in our genes. As humans, we share 99.9% of our DNA with any given individual between us, right? So there's only 0.1% of a difference between any of us. There is more genetic variation in emperor penguins, which look identical to each other, than there is in humans. As a matter of fact, there's more genetic variation in dogs than there is in humans. So if we look at kind of our genetic diversity champions here, since humans are one of the least genetically diverse species on the planet, we have the Daphnia pulex, otherwise known as the common water flea. It has 31,000 genes within its genome, right? Just to compare to humans, we only have 23,000, right? So what advantage does genetic diversity have, right? This diversity makes a species far more adaptable to genetic conditions, right? It's far more adaptive to environmental conditions, far more responsive to its environment, right? If we go back to Charles Darwin's original words, it is not the strongest nor the smartest of the species that survive, but those most responsive to change, right? And having a high degree of genetic diversity allows you to create and respond to change more effectively. The most genetically diverse place on Earth, of course, is Africa, right? And this is probably because all people can trace their ancestry back to Africa to around 180,000 to 280,000 years ago, right? And it makes a lot of sense, right? This is the place where humans have existed the longest. It's the place where humans have had the longest to breed and the longest to interact. So, of course, there's going to be the greatest genetic diversity amongst people in Africa. So over the course of our evolutionary history, looking at modern human genome, we have lost 40.7 million base pairs as we have evolved over time, right? So large segments of DNA from an extinct early human ancestor called the Denisovans in the genomes of people from South Pacific, right? So in essence, what this is saying is that, man, there's a lot of high mobility in early human species, right? So essentially, there's going to be, segments of our DNA that can come from different parts of the globe, right? There are genetic clusters, but only in single genes, right? Not in gene groupings. So one of the big questions, that modern scientists have really been looking at in terms of how do we explain this lack of genetic diversity in humans is, well, there are a few different competing hypotheses. We have one called the Catastrophe Theory, which actually should not be called a theory. It should be called a hypothesis because it lacks fossil evidence. It proposes that a volcanic event at or around 75,000 years ago caused a worldwide volcanic winter. This event caused a bottleneck of archaic Homo sapien populations, and out of which came the less genetically diverse modern humans, which is what we are a part of. This does lack a significant amount of evidence. We do know that there was a large volcanic eruption in Southeast Asia at or around 75,000 years ago on an island called Toba, but there is no evidence that there were mass extinctions. There's no evidence that really much of the life on the planet was really disrupted by this volcanic eruption, right? So it probably killed some humans that lived in the surrounding area, but was it enough to cause a huge, massive bottleneck in population? Most likely not. So, in essence, scientists were not really sure what caused a severe human bottleneck. Some proposed an unknown treponemal disease or virus, and at what point human populations were as low as a few thousand, right? And I think today, with the pandemic and the coronavirus going around and everything occurring then, you can kind of really see how this might be a very valid explanation as to how human populations could have been severely declined during this period, right? If we came across a disease in which we had no immunity and no modern medicine to deal with, you can see how only those individuals who had a specific genetic mutation that gave them resistance to disease would be the ones that survived, right? So this is probably a recurring pattern across most of our evolutionary history that we can't really prove with fossil evidence, but we know based on, modern history of disease and how it's affected humans that this likely happened in the past as well, right? So diseases played a significant role. So most likely that severe bottleneck in population was the result of some sort of virulent disease. So in essence, do races exist, right? Well, racial categories only work with single trait schemas, right? So if you're only looking at a very single trait like skin color or eye color or things like that, yes, you will be able to hold up some racial categories, right? But in essence, they are arbitrary heurism, right? They are simply just a way to categorize humans. If you peel away the outside flesh of everyone, we are so genetically similar to one another that we could not really say that there are such a thing as race, right? So thus, we should really rest on the notion that Gould explains of this complex variation, right? Humans are just the result of a complex cycle of increasing and decreasing variation over time. So to kind of conclude, this is still kind of our introductory session here. Racial categories do not exist biologically. We will talk more of this in depth, and we'll go more in depth into the kind of history of scientific racism as we move through the semester. Science has sought to create racial categories based on a plethora of anatomical traits, and race today is, of course, recognized exclusively as a social construct, but it is a social construct which has real and distinct effects in society, right? I don't want us to get into the notion of color blindness where we try to pretend that, well, since we know that race doesn't exist biologically, that we really should pretend that it doesn't exist at all in society, and that really discounts and really doesn't recognize the history of racism in society, right? It's one of those cat out of the bag arguments. We can no longer, or we can never really assume that race doesn't exist solely because we created it socially and it has existed for so long, right? So we can't just ignore the effects that has had on certain groups of people within our societies. So essentially, notions on race are based on human ranking systems. Skin color is one of the easiest outward visual ways to discriminate between groups of people. And ranking arose based initially on aggrandizing within proto-human Homo sapien groups. We'll talk about this more later. And later on resource distribution and economies and resource access, right? So in essence, and what we'll kind of conclude towards the end of the semester here is that it was really kind of this human greed or this evolutionary tendency for humans to be greedy and take resources from one another and hoard resources from one another, which is really what developed into human racism, right? We had to create ways in which to create different levels of people so that we can create different ways to hoard access, right? To deny access from certain individuals so that we ourselves can keep more resources for ourselves. So what really turned into kind of an evolutionary tendency to hoard during times of starvation and things like that in our way back evolutionary past when we were little more than two-legged apes walking around, really kind of turned into this notion of, well, resources began to become more complex. The variation in resources became more complex. Humans themselves became more complex, so our notion of greed became more complex, and our notion of keeping resources restricted and keeping more for ourselves became more complex as well. So we'll talk a lot more of this in detail as we move through the semester, and we'll also talk a lot more on kind of where we are today in terms of science and race.